All right, Chapter 6, Metabolism, Energy, and Enzymes. In this chapter, we're going to be covering cells and the flow of energy, metabolic reactions and energy transformations, and then finally, we're going to spend a bit of time on metabolic pathways and enzymes. So starting off with cells and the flow of energy. As we've talked about previously, all life on Earth ultimately depends on the flow of energy from the sun. Autotrophs, or producers, are going to harness solar energy in the form of chemical energy or carbohydrates, which are then going to be taken up by heterotrophs, such as herbivores, or primary consumers. The energy flows from the primary consumers to secondary consumers, or the carnivores, until it finally reaches the decomposers. And we're going to talk about this energy flow extensively when we talk about ecology and when we study various components of the environment. But what you need to know is that energy goes from the sun to the plants, to the animals that eat the plants, and to the animals that eat the animals that eat the plants. This is the flow of energy, but it all comes back to the sun. So in this chapter, we're going to be studying energy on a cellular level, but in order to do that, we're first going to define what energy is. Energy is just the ability to do work or bring about a change. The general characteristics of life, including growth, development, metabolism, reproduction, all of those things, all those characteristics of life are going to require energy to make that come about. Energy is going to come in two forms: kinetic energy and potential energy. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion. It requires movement, the energy used or expended when walking or moving, or the energy released when water goes over a waterfall. That's all energy of motion. That's all sort of kind of active current energy, and we call that kinetic energy. Now, or you may also see this referred to as mechanical energy. So it's the energy of movement. There's also going to be potential energy. Potential energy is stored energy. It's stored energy, or it's energy whose capacity to accomplish work is not currently being used at the moment. So it's kind of like the batteries sitting in your drawer. I don't know about you, but I have always had, in every home I've ever had, every apartment I've ever lived in, there's always a battery drawer. A drawer full of the random odds, ends, always the loose batteries that you just don't seem to know what they belong to. Those batteries are full of potential energy. It's not till you pull them out and put them in the remote or the flashlight or the smoke detector that they start doing kinetic energy or mechanical energy. So potential energy is stored energy. Another great example of this would be the food that you eat. The food that you eat is stored energy. It's chemical energy. So chemical energy is just a type of potential energy. Batteries, that's another type of stored potential energy. In this class, we're going to focus on chemical energy. Chemical energy is going to be stored chemical energy, things like glucose. The food that you eat is potential energy. It's energy that has not yet been turned into kinetic energy, or mechanical energy. So the food you eat is stored energy, stored in the form of chemical energy. Carbohydrates are going to be our primary form of stored energy. When you walk or run or lift your pencil to take notes, you're turning that stored chemical energy into kinetic mechanical energy. So here we have a diagram that just shows the flow of energy through the environment. We have solar energy that gets taken up by the plants. Plants are going to convert that into chemical energy. That chemical energy is going to be eaten by the moose and turned into mechanical energy. Now here's the interesting thing. At every single stage of energy transformation, we're going to see that energy transformations are not 100% efficient. There is going to be a slight loss of energy. When we convert solar energy to chemical energy, a good deal of that is going to be lost in the form of heat. This is pretty obvious when you step outside and you step into the sunlight and it's nice and warm. You step into the shade and it's nice and cool. A lot of that solar energy is being used for heat, and even the conversion of converting, and we'll see that happening on a very, very small level. But when we convert solar energy into carbohydrates, the plants themselves are going to give off a small amount of heat during that process. Then when animals eat that, eat the chemical energy, eat the carbohydrates, and start to move or start to walk, they're going to convert that chemical energy into mechanical energy. But a great deal of that is also going to be given off in the form of heat. So we're going to talk about this sort of conversion. We're going to talk about thermodynamics next. So the study of heat and energy and their interactions with the world around them is called thermodynamics. There are two laws of thermodynamics that explain how and why energy flows through ecosystems and then through those individual cells. The first law of thermodynamics is the law of conservation of energy. This states that energy can neither be created or destroyed. It can be changed from one form to another. So we don't ever destroy energy. We don't lose energy necessarily. We just convert it. We're converting solar energy into carbohydrates and heat. So energy is not going to be used up. It's just going to be transferred and stored as chemical energy when forming carbohydrates. However, as I said before, the bulk of solar energy is going to be dissipated in the form of heat. Which brings us to our next, we'll finish up with the conservation of energy. Photosynthesizing leaves are going to capture that solar energy. Some energy is going to be used to form carbohydrates from carbon dioxide and water, but much of the energy dissipates as heat. Even that energy that is used to form carbohydrates from carbon dioxide and water, even that stored chemical energy is ultimately going to be dissipated in heat. That chemical energy can be transferred to mechanical energy, which again is going to dissipate in the form of heat. Whenever we move or walk, potential energy stored in carbohydrates is going to be transformed into kinetic energy when we contract our muscles. As our muscles use this energy, none of it's destroyed, but each energy exchange process produces heat, which is going to dissipate into the environment and bring us to our second law of thermodynamics, and that would be the law of entropy. When heat dissipates into the environment, it's no longer usable. So it's going to be unable to do work. And as we said before, energy is the ability to do work. It's the ability to do work. And when we convert to heat, heat is sort of the least useful form of energy out there. It's the least amount of capacity to do work. It's unstable. It's not usable. It's unavailable for work. Each transfer of energy is going to give off some heat. So with each transfer, there's going to be less and less energy that is available to do work. So there's a great deal of energy that is, it's not destroyed, but it is lost in the sense that it's no longer usable for us. And this is going to happen at every single conversion because no conversion of energy is 100% efficient. Most energy is going to be lost in the form of heat. In cars, the internal combustion engine is between 20 and 30% efficient. At most, we're at 30% efficiency at converting the chemical energy stored in gasoline into mechanical energy to move the car forward. So think about that. Next time you're filling up your gas tank and you fill your tank up all the way and you spend, $30 on gas to fill up your tank, only about $10 of that is actually going to be used to move your car forward. Most of that gas is going to just be burned off. Most of that energy is just going to be burned off and released into the environment in the form of heat. Only about 10% of that energy is actually going to be used to push your car forward. So the majority of energy in every form of conversion is going to be lost in heat. Same holds true for these natural processes as well. None of these are going to be 100% efficient. A lot of energy is going to be lost at every stage. Another way to understand entropy is to say that every transformation of energy makes the universe less organized, less structured, or more disorganized and chaotic. The term entropy can be used to mean the relative amount of disorganization. And the processes occurring in the cell are forms of energy transformation. Each transformation gives off heat, the least useful or the most disorganized form of energy. So that means with each energy transformation in the cell, entropy is increasing in the universe. And there's now less energy available to do useful work. So for example, Glucose tends to break apart into carbon dioxide and water over time. Now, glucose is more organized. It's less stable than water and oxygen. So glucose is sort of a complex molecule. It's more organized, and it's less stable than its breakdown products. If you compare this to a neat room, a clean room is more organized, but it's less stable than a messy room. Over time, dust is going to build up. If you don't constantly clean up after yourself, messes are going to be made. Really, your whole life, even if you're not a messy person, is a series of making messes and cleaning them up. If you get a drink of water, you get out a cup, you put water in it, you drink out of it, then you have to put it in the dishwater or wash it or throw it away. But you're constantly going to be making a mess unless you expend energy to clean that mess back up. So energy is going to be required to make that room, that messy room, more neat. So similarly, the input of energy from photosynthesis or the sun makes glucose from carbon dioxide and water. Glucose is more organized, it's less stable than its breakdown products, carbon dioxide and water. If, however, we have carbon dioxide and water and we add energy to the process, we can make glucose again. So if entropy or the disorganization is always increasing, how are plants able to turn carbon dioxide and water into glucose? It depends on energy from that external source. The sun is going to be used to organize those structures in biological molecules. Organisms called producers use energy to create an organized structure in biological molecules. And organisms that consume producers can use this potential energy to drive their own processes. Ultimately, all living organisms are going to depend on a constant supply of solar energy. Everything comes back to solar energy from the sun. All right, so here is another diagram that I really like that talks about cells and entropy, because it kind of brings us back to chapter 2 when we talked about atoms and we talked about molecules and forming chemical bonds. And then it also brings us to chapter 4 when we talked about, chapter 5 when we talked about diffusion. So if you look at this, cells and entropy, glucose is going to be an organized molecule. It has more potential energy, but it's less stable, which means it has less entropy. Entropy is a measurement of disorganization and instability. So it has less entropy. However, if we release kinetic energy, if we break that glucose down into ATP, we're going to end up with a less organized, less potential energy. There's very little energy stored in each one of these bonds. There was a lot of energy stored in all of these bonds, very little energy when it's chaotic like this. But it is a lot more stable. It's a lot more stable, and we do have a lot more entropy here, a lot more sort of chaos. Another really great example of this is going to be diffusion. Remember when we talked about diffusion is a movement from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration? What you see is very organized. There's a lot of potential energy, meaning that there's a whole bunch of stored molecules on this side that need to go on that side. So this is stored energy. We have an unequal distribution of ions, which means it's more organized. There's more potential for energy, but it's a less stable. It's a less stable sort of situation. Do you remember what we talked about? What happens in diffusion? When we have a concentration gradient like this, where we have a high concentration on one side and a low concentration on the other side, what happens if you plop down a protein channel in there? We're going to get diffusion. Diffusion is going to be the movement of those ions from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So now we suddenly have an equal distribution of hydrogen ions, but this situation is less organized. There's less potential energy because at some point, once we reach equilibrium, we're not going to see a drive of hydrogen ions across that plasma membrane once we reach equilibrium on both sides. This is going to be a much more stable situation. The cell is going to hang out at equilibrium just like this with an even distribution on both sides of the plasma membrane unless we do something about it. Now, the reason that we call this potential energy, and I know we haven't really talked about it yet, but we will talk about it in chapter 7 and 8. When you see a high concentration gradient like this of hydrogen ions, look at all those little charged molecules. We can use that to create an electrical current. We can use that to generate energy, just like we can use the stored chemical energy inside of a battery to power various electrical things. We can do the same thing with a high concentration gradient of ions. And so when we don't have that flow of ions anymore, we lose out. We lose out on that potential energy.